Julian's needle froze mid-stitch when a giant orc woman crashed through his shop door and tore it off its hinges. The wood split with a dry crack and slammed against the wall. She stumbled over the threshold and hit the floorboards hard enough to rattle his cutting table. Mud smeared across the planks. Blood followed in uneven drops. What remained of her armor hung in strips, leather shredded, metal buckles twisted, fabric reduced to filthy ribbons that barely covered her. She did not look at him first. She scanned the room like a hunted animal, chest heaving, shoulders tight, eyes sharp and wide. Then she pushed herself up on one elbow and dragged her massive body toward the darkest corner between the fabric shelves and the cold iron press. Her back hit the wall. One hand searched blindly for a weapon that was no longer there. Julian slowly set his embroidery hoop aside. The silk thread slipped from his fingers and dangled uselessly. He did not scream. He did not run. His gaze moved from the broken door to the splintered frame, and then, with a tightening of his jaw, to the disaster that was her clothing. Leather straps torn at uneven angles, stitching ripped instead of cut, seams forced apart with brute strength instead of carefully unpicked, a breastplate reduced to hanging scraps that twisted her silhouette into something chaotic and wrong. The offense of it struck him deeper than the shattered door. She pressed herself lower into the shadows, trying to fold her towering frame into a space meant for crates of wool. The movement pulled one of the ragged straps loose. It slid off her shoulder and fell with a wet sound onto the floor. Julian's eyes narrowed. "Do not move," he said at last, his voice flat and controlled, as if addressing a careless apprentice about to ruin a sleeve. She bared her teeth at him. Blood trickled from a cut along her temple, tracing down over green skin marked with old scars. Her breathing was loud in the small shop. Outside, distant voices echoed somewhere in the alley, but none came closer yet. Julian stepped around his overturned stool and approached the fallen door first. He inspected the damage, ran his fingers along the splintered edge, then lifted it with effort and leaned it back into place. It hung crooked, barely balanced in the frame. He wedged a crate beneath it to keep it from collapsing inward again. Only then did he turn fully toward her. She was enormous against his narrow shelves, knees drawn up awkwardly, shoulders nearly brushing the hanging coats. The rags clung to her in humiliating patches. This was not armor. This was not clothing. This was an insult. He picked up his measuring tape from the work table. The orc's eyes followed the movement. Her muscles tightened. One hand dug into the floorboards as if ready to spring. Julian walked toward her with small, precise steps, tape draped around his neck like a ceremonial chain. He stopped a few paces away and tilted his head, studying the torn leather across her chest as if it were a misaligned hem. "You are ruining the drape," he said quietly. She blinked. A drop of blood fell from her elbow and spread slowly over the wood between them. He crouched, not to help her up, not to offer comfort, but to lift one of the dangling straps between two fingers. He examined the jagged tear, the uneven edge, the way it twisted the line of her shoulders. "This was never fitted properly," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "No balance, no structure. Whoever made this should be ashamed." The orc's breathing slowed just slightly, confusion flickering across her face. She glanced at the door, at the windows, at him. Julian stood again, straightened his vest, and gave her a long, assessing look from head to toe. Mud, blood, rags. A body built like a fortress, reduced to scraps. His voice hardened. "If you intend to bleed on my floor, at least stand up properly." Outside, heavy footsteps echoed faintly down the alley, closer now, deliberate and searching. She pushed herself higher against the wall, teeth bared, and when Julian stepped closer with a needle and black thread pinched between his fingers, she snapped, "Touch me with that, and I will snap your neck!" Her voice was rough from dust and shouting, low and steady despite the blood on her skin. The threat filled the small shop easily. It should have been enough to make any sane man retreat. Julian did not retreat. He stopped at arm's length, close enough to see the uneven stitching that held together what remained of her leather top. He glanced at her hands, large enough to crush his throat without effort, then back to the torn seam hanging crooked over her ribs. His expression tightened, not in fear, but in sharp disapproval. "If I intended to harm you," he said calmly, lifting the needle slightly, "I would not choose such a blunt instrument." Her nostrils flared. She shifted her weight as if preparing to lunge, but the movement pulled another seam apart with a dry rip. The sound made Julian wince. He leaned forward and caught the loose edge of leather before it fell away completely. "Stop doing that," he said, irritation creeping into his voice. "You are making it worse." She stared at him as though he had spoken in another language. Blood slid down her forearm and dripped from her elbow again. He noticed it only because it threatened to stain a roll of pale linen behind her. With a quick motion, he dragged the linen out of reach and set it on the table. Then he crouched slightly to inspect the damage more closely, keeping his movements precise and economical. "You are holding your shoulders unevenly," he continued, as if conducting a routine fitting for a noble client. "One side is higher. It twists the line. Stand straight." He gestured with the needle, not at her throat, but at her posture. She let out a low growl, the sound vibrating in her chest, yet she did not strike. Instead, confusion crept into her expression. No one in the pits had ever spoken to her about lines or balance. They had shouted orders. They had thrown chains. This small human was frowning at her like she was an apprentice who had botched a hem. He reached forward suddenly and pinched the torn leather at her side, pulling it together to examine how it had originally been cut. Her muscles tensed under his touch. The needle hovered dangerously close to her skin. For a second, the air between them felt tight enough to snap. "Hold still," he said, sharper now. "If you flinch, I will prick you, and then you will bleed even more on my floor." Her eyes narrowed. "You fear nothing," she muttered, voice quieter but no less hard. "I fear asymmetry," Julian replied without looking up. "And incompetence." He began stitching the torn edge with small, fast movements, repairing just enough to keep the leather from falling apart entirely. His hands trembled slightly, but the stitches remained even. She watched him from above, breathing slowing despite herself. The needle flashed in and out of the dark material, pulling it into shape. When he finished the temporary seam, he leaned back on his heels and examined his work critically. "This is only to prevent further disgrace," he said. "You cannot remain like this." She followed his gaze downward, taking in the shredded armor, the strips that exposed too much, the humiliating chaos of it. Her jaw tightened. She crossed one arm over her chest, the gesture almost protective. Julian stood and met her eyes at last. There was no mockery in his face, only offense on behalf of the fabric. "You may threaten my neck if you wish," he said evenly, draping the measuring tape into his hand, "but you will not sit in my shop dressed like a battlefield accident." Outside, heavy footsteps paused somewhere beyond the crooked door, and a voice called out a name that did not belong to Julian. Julian flicked the measuring tape open with a sharp snap and stepped closer before she could decide whether to bare her teeth again, and the orc watched him as if he were mad, her back still pressed to the wall while he circled her slowly, studying angles and proportions instead of the size of her fists. He did not ask permission. He did not comment on the blood drying along her ribs. He simply lifted the tape toward her shoulder and said, "If you continue to hunch like that, nothing will fit correctly. Stand up." She did not move at first. Her eyes darted to the crooked door, then to the windows, then back to him. He reached forward and tapped her sternum lightly with 2 fingers, firm but not aggressive. "Straight," he insisted. "You are built like a tower. Stop pretending you are a pile of laundry." The words seemed to land harder than any insult. Her jaw shifted. Slowly, with visible reluctance, she pushed herself off the wall and rose to her full height. The movement forced Julian to tilt his head back, the top of her shoulder nearly aligned with the hanging lamps. She was bruised, scarred, and still shaking from whatever she had fled. But when she stood fully upright, the space around her changed. Julian nodded once, satisfied. He stepped in close, so close that the edge of her torn leather brushed his vest, and wrapped the tape around her chest, careful to keep his touch efficient. The tape looked fragile against her broad frame. His fingers worked quickly, calling out numbers under his breath, memorizing them rather than writing them down. He measured her shoulders, her waist, the length of her arm from shoulder to wrist, the distance from collarbone to hip. Each time the tape slid across her skin, her muscles tightened, ready to react. At one point she caught his wrist in her hand, not squeezing, just holding. The difference in size was absurd. His entire wrist disappeared in her grip. He froze, meeting her gaze. There was no pleading in his eyes, no apology. "If you break my hand," he said quietly, "you will remain in rags." For a long second she did not release him. Then, slowly, her fingers opened. He withdrew his hand and continued measuring as if nothing had happened. "You are not afraid," she said, her voice lower now, less sharp. "I am busy," he replied, stepping back to assess her silhouette. He squinted, adjusting his position slightly to see how the patched leather pulled at her side. "Fear wastes time." She looked down at herself, at the crude stitches he had just placed to keep the armor from falling apart. The thread was straight, even, intentional. It held. He moved to his work table and pulled out a roll of heavy, dark cloth, laying it flat with care. He glanced back at her and gestured toward the center of the room. "Come here. Light is better." She hesitated, then took one heavy step forward. The floor creaked under her weight. Another step. She stopped where he pointed, standing awkwardly in the open, as if expecting chains to drop from the ceiling. Julian began marking chalk lines across the fabric with quick, precise strokes. His hands moved with confidence that did not match the tremor in his fingers. He glanced up at her again. "Lift your arms." She did, slowly. The torn leather shifted again, exposing more scars along her side. Old cuts, burn marks, evidence of years treated like livestock in a ring. He did not comment on them. He only adjusted his chalk line. "You fought in pits," he said flatly, not as a question but as a measurement of fact. Her chin lifted slightly. "I was owned," she replied. He paused for half a heartbeat, then continued drawing. "Not here." The words hung between them. She did not answer. Instead, she lowered her arms when he signaled and watched as he began cutting the fabric with long, clean strokes of his shears. The sound of steel slicing cloth filled the shop, steady and controlled. Outside, the faint echo of voices drifted again, closer than before, then faded as if moving past. She turned her head sharply toward the door, muscles coiling. Julian did not look up. "If they were coming in," he said, "the door would already be on the floor again." "Hold still." He gathered the first cut panels and stepped toward her, lifting one against her torso to judge the fit. The dark fabric covered the worst of the rags immediately, restoring a shape that looked deliberate instead of broken. He adjusted it at her shoulder, smoothing it down over her chest with brisk, professional motions. She stared at him, confusion deepening. No one had ever covered her like this without intent to bind her. "You make no sense," she muttered. Julian gave a small, irritated exhale. "On the contrary," he said, aligning the edge of the cloth along her side, "this is the first sensible thing that has happened to you all day." He stepped back, head tilted, assessing. For the first time since she had burst through his door, she was not shrinking into a corner. She stood in the middle of the room, half wrapped in dark fabric, towering and uncertain, while a disgraced tailor examined her like a masterpiece in progress. And outside, somewhere at the far end of the alley, a heavy object struck brick with a dull, rhythmic knock. Julian pushed the newly cut panels aside and pointed toward the narrow door behind his cutting table. Then, without ceremony, he said, "You will rest before I continue, because exhaustion ruins posture." And the orc blinked at him as if he had suggested something obscene. He crossed the small space to the back room, opened the door, and revealed a bed hardly large enough for him, neatly made, blanket folded with strict symmetry. He returned carrying a clean cloth and a chipped ceramic cup, setting both down on the table with the same care he used for silk. She remained standing where he had left her, half draped in dark fabric, breathing slower now, but still ready to bolt. He dipped the cloth into a basin of water and stepped toward her again, lifting his chin in a silent order. "Sit," he said, nodding toward a sturdy wooden chair reinforced with extra braces. After a pause that stretched too long, she lowered herself onto it, the wood groaning under her weight. He began wiping the drying blood from her forearm without comment, movements brisk and practical. She flinched once when the cloth pressed against a deeper cut, and his hand stilled only long enough to adjust the pressure. "If you tear the stitches again, I will have to redo them," he said, as if that were the true tragedy here. The absurdity of it made her stare at him in open disbelief. He handed her the cup. Steam curled from it, thin and steady. "Drink," he instructed. "It is only tea." She held the cup awkwardly between fingers scarred and thickened from years of combat, the fragile clay looking as if it might shatter at any second. She sniffed it first, suspicious, then took a cautious sip. The warmth seemed to catch her off guard. Her shoulders lowered a fraction. She drank again, slower this time, eyes never leaving him as he moved about the shop collecting scattered tools and righting the overturned stool. He worked methodically, as if the broken door and the giant fugitive in his chair were minor inconveniences in an otherwise orderly day. When he finished tidying the front room as much as he could, he gestured toward the back. "The bed," he said. "You will lie down." She gave a low scoff. "I do not sleep in cages," she replied, though there was less bite in it than before. He gave her a flat look. "It is not a cage. It is a bed. And if you collapse on my floor, you will stain the oak." After a moment, she stood and followed him into the back room, ducking slightly to avoid the doorframe. The bed was small beneath her massive frame, but she lowered herself onto it carefully, as if afraid to break it. Her feet nearly hung off the edge. Julian pulled the blanket up without ceremony and stepped back, assessing her as he would a garment. "You will not be safe in the street tonight," he said, not unkindly, just stating a fact. "Here you will." She watched him closely, waiting for the condition that always followed such offers. None came. He turned away, returning to the front room, leaving the door half open. For a long time she lay stiff, eyes open, listening. The shop was quiet except for the soft scrape of his scissors trimming loose threads, and the occasional clink of metal tools being set into place. No chains, no shouting, no betting crowds. just the steady rhythm of a man working late. Eventually, her breathing deepened. One hand, which had remained clenched on the blanket, as if ready to fight even in sleep, slowly relaxed. The cup of tea sat empty on the small crate beside the bed. In the front room, Julian paused in his cutting and glanced toward the doorway, ensuring she still breathed evenly. He adjusted the crooked door once more, wedging it tighter with another crate. The alley beyond was silent for now. As night settled fully, he extinguished all but one lamp and resumed stitching the dark fabric by hand, preparing the first rough seams of what would become her new garments. The needle moved steadily through the cloth. In the back room, for the first time in her life, the orc slept without chains on her wrists. And just before dawn, faint voices drifted again from the far end of the alley, closer than they had been before. Julian was halfway through pressing a seam flat when the first hard knock hit the crooked door, and the whole patched frame shuddered as if it might give up out of spite. He did not jump, but the iron press handle slipped a fraction in his hand, leaving a faint, ugly crease in the dark cloth, and his mouth tightened at the mistake. Another knock followed, louder. Then a third, not polite anymore, more like a demand delivered through wood. He set the cloth aside with care, wiped his hands on a scrap of linen, and walked to the door without rushing, shoulders squared, as if this were a fitting appointment he had no patience for. The back room creaked behind him as Karga shifted on the bed. Then the doorway filled with her silhouette, too large for the frame, wrapped now in a hastily patched human shirt he had thrown together before dawn from spare fabric and an old underlayer he refused to wear again. The shirt sat awkwardly on her, seams stretched, sleeves cut and rejoined to accommodate her arms. But it covered her, and the simple fact of it made her look less like a fleeing animal and more like a person forced into the wrong size for the world. Julian did not look back at her. He lifted the latch and pulled the door open just enough to show his face and the tip of his shoe, keeping his body in the gap like a barrier. Two men stood outside, boots sunk in mud, shoulders hunched in the alley's narrow space. Their clothes were worn, but their belts were heavy with cheap blades and the confidence of people who came to collect, not to negotiate. One of them leaned forward and sniffed the air as if Julian's shop owed him the privilege of breathing. "Tailor," he said, dragging the word out. "It is time." His eyes slid past Julian's shoulder, trying to see inside. Julian stepped a fraction to block the view and spoke with the clipped tone he reserved for customers who touched fabric with dirty hands. "You have chosen an inconvenient hour." The second man laughed, short and sharp. "You do not set hours. You pay for your hinges to stay on." His gaze dropped to the broken door frame, then lifted again with a grin. "Looks like you already missed a payment." Julian's jaw tightened. He did not explain. He did not plead. He reached into his vest pocket slowly, not for coins, but for the calm habit of his old life, and pulled out nothing at all, because there was nothing to pull out. He kept his hand there anyway, holding the posture of a man who could pay if he wished. "I will not," he said, each word placed like a stitch. The first man's smile thinned. He shifted his weight, boots scraping. "You will," he replied, and raised a hand as if to push the door wider. Julian's shoulder moved instantly, closing the gap, and the wood creaked under the pressure. For a heartbeat, it was just the two men and a frail Tailor bracing himself against a shove he could not stop. Then a shadow fell over Julian's shoulder, thick and solid, and the alley seemed to shrink. Karga stepped forward until she stood directly behind him, close enough that the heat of her body reached his back through his vest. She did not speak. She did not bare her teeth. She simply straightened to her full height in the doorway, head nearly brushing the top beam, patched shirt hanging from her like a banner that had survived a war. Her hands rested at her sides, relaxed, but the scars across her knuckles and the old bruising on her forearms told the story of what those hands had been trained to do. One of the men looked up, and his grin vanished so fast it was almost comical. The other took a half-step back without realizing it, boots sliding in mud. Their eyes flicked from her face to her shoulders to the width of her stance, measuring the space she occupied, doing the kind of math men like them understood. Julian remained in front, still blocking the door, still the one speaking, but the balance of the alley had shifted. He lifted his chin. "You are interrupting my work," he said, voice steady, as if Karga were a piece of furniture and not a weapon standing upright. The first man swallowed, Adam's apple bobbing. He tried to recover, squaring his shoulders, but his gaze kept betraying him, darting to her hands again. "Who is that?" he demanded, and his voice cracked on the last word. Karga leaned down slightly, not enough to loom for drama, just enough that her presence filled their vision. Her eyes were calm now, not frantic like the night before. The tea and the quiet and the simple act of being covered had changed something in how she held herself. She did not reach for them. She did not need to. Julian felt the air move when she exhaled, slow and controlled, and the men heard it too. The second man made a small sound, halfway between a laugh and a cough, then shifted his belt as if checking whether his blade was still there. A pointless gesture that fooled no one. "She is my client," Julian said, and the word client landed in the alley like a slap of etiquette. He pushed the door open a little wider, not to invite them in, but to show them what they would be facing if they tried. The first man took another step back, eyes wide now, trying to pretend it was strategy and not fear. "We will return," he muttered, and the threat sounded thin against the reality of Karga's silent stare. Julian did not answer. He only held his ground until both men turned and left, boots splashing through the mud with quick, embarrassed steps, their shoulders tight as if expecting a strike in the back. When the alley finally fell quiet again, Julian closed the door and set the latch with a firm click. The shop felt smaller with Karga standing in it, but also steadier, like a heavy beam had been placed where the wall used to wobble. He turned and found her watching him, expression unreadable, patched shirt tugged straight across her chest as if she had adjusted it herself without thinking. He picked up his measuring tape again, habit refusing to bow to chaos. "Stand in the light," he said, already moving toward the table. Karga hesitated, then obeyed with a single step forward, and as she did, a faint, rhythmic banging returned outside, closer than before, like someone testing doors along the street. Julian dragged the heavy roll of thick leather onto his main table and unfastened the straps that kept it tight, the material thudding against the wood with a weight that matched the figure now standing in the light. And without looking up, he said, "Remove the patched shirt. Carefully. I will need accurate lines." As if he were addressing a duchess who had arrived early for a winter fitting. Karga's hands paused at the hem, her jaw tightening for a brief second. But she did as told, pulling the human garment over her head with controlled movements and folding it once before setting it aside, a small gesture of respect she did not comment on. The scars along her torso caught the morning light, pale lines crossing darker skin, each one straight or jagged depending on the blade that had made it, and Julian's eyes moved over them, not with pity, but with calculation, mapping where seams must avoid friction and where reinforcement would be needed. He circled her slowly, lifting the leather against her back, checking how it curved along her shoulders, then stepping around to assess the front, his fingertips pressing and releasing with professional detachment. The contrast between them was almost absurd. His hands were narrow, fingers long and precise, accustomed to silk and velvet, while her frame was built for impact and endurance, muscles defined not by vanity but by survival. When he lifted a panel to her chest and adjusted it at the collarbone, he had to stand on the edge of a low stool to reach properly, and even then his head barely aligned with her shoulder. "Do not lock your knees," he instructed, tapping lightly at her thigh when she stiffened. "You are bracing for a strike." "This is not a strike." She glanced down at him, confusion flickering again, then consciously relaxed her stance, though the instinct to tense seemed to hover just beneath her skin. He marked the leather with chalk, short, decisive lines indicating where it would be cut to follow her shape without constricting movement. "This will not be armor," he said, slicing through the first section with his large shears, the blades biting cleanly through the thick material. "Armor is meant to absorb blows. This is meant to hold you." The distinction hung in the air. She watched the pieces separate under his steady hands, her breathing slowing to match the rhythm of the cutting. He moved to the iron press, testing its handle with a practiced grip, and the machine gave a protesting squeal as he lowered it to flatten a seam. The sound was wrong. He lifted the press again and tried once more. The hinge stuck halfway, jerking unevenly. His mouth pressed into a thin line. "Of all mornings," he muttered, nudging the mechanism with irritation. Karga stepped closer, drawn by the metallic complaint. She examined the press without asking permission, her large hands hovering near the hinge. Julian instinctively placed himself between her and the delicate parts, then hesitated when he saw the way she was studying the broken pin rather than the structure. "It sticks," she observed, voice neutral. He exhaled through his nose. "Yes, it sticks." Without further comment, she reached past him, fingers closing around the iron bar that served as the lever. The size difference was stark. Where his grip covered only a portion, hers swallowed it entirely. She lifted the press with a single smooth motion, exposing the warped hinge beneath. Julian stepped back, ready to protest if she crushed it, but she did not. Instead, she braced the base with her foot and applied pressure at a precise angle, metal groaning as it shifted back into alignment. There was no flourish in the movement, only efficient strength. She lowered the press carefully and released it. Julian tested the handle again. This time it descended evenly, pressing the leather seam flat without protest. He looked at the hinge, then at her, then back at the hinge, as if recalculating the laws of his small universe. "Do not bend it again," he said finally, the closest he came to gratitude. She snorted softly, not offended. He returned to the leather pieces, aligning them along her torso and pinning them temporarily to assess the fit. The pins looked insignificant against her skin, but she held still, eyes forward, allowing him to adjust the angle of the shoulder seam and the curve at her waist. When a pin grazed an old scar, she flinched, and his hand paused. He shifted the seam half an inch to avoid the tender line. "This will sit better," he said, almost to himself. As the structure began to take shape, the garment no longer resembled scraps held together by necessity. It suggested intention. Broad shoulders defined by clean lines, waist drawn in slightly to allow movement without bulk, panels layered to create depth rather than weight. Karga watched the transformation with growing focus, her gaze following his hands as if tracking a sparring partner. He stepped back again, studying her in the half-assembled leather, head tilted critically. "You are built for balance," he said, adjusting a panel that hung too low. "Whoever dressed you before tried to make you look larger than you are. That was unnecessary." She raised an eyebrow. Larger was all she had ever been asked to be. Outside, something heavy scraped along brick, followed by a muffled voice, too distant to make out the words, but close enough to tighten the air. Karga's head snapped toward the sound, muscles tensing again, ready to revert to the stance he had just corrected. Julian did not look toward the window. He picked up another pin and met her eyes. "Hold the line," he said firmly. And this time when she straightened, she did it not from fear, but because he had told her to. Julian unlocked a narrow wooden chest beneath his work table and drew out a carefully wrapped bundle, the movement deliberate and almost ceremonial. And when he unfolded the layers of plain cloth, a length of deep blue silk caught the light with a quiet sheen that did not belong in a slum shop with a broken door. He held it in both hands for a moment, inspecting it for dust as if it were still destined for a royal court instead of standing before a former pit fighter. And then he turned toward Karga without announcement. The leather base of her new garment was pinned but unfinished, strong and structured, yet raw. And the silk in his hands was the opposite, fluid and soft, expensive in a way that could not be hidden. She saw it and stiffened, eyes narrowing slightly, as if expecting a trick. Silk had never been meant for her kind, not in the world she knew. He stepped onto the stool again to reach her shoulders and said simply, "Do not move." His voice quieter than before, not sharp now, but firm. The silk brushed against her collarbone as he lifted it over her shoulders, and she inhaled sharply at the unfamiliar sensation, the fabric sliding over scarred skin without catching, without scraping. For a second her hands twitched at her sides, fingers flexing as if she might tear it away. Instead, she closed her eyes. The change was subtle, but unmistakable. Her shoulders lowered, not in defeat, but in surrender to the moment. She stood perfectly still, chin level, breathing slow, allowing him to arrange the silk across her upper back and chest, to smooth it down along the leather beneath. The shop was silent, except for the faint rustle of the fabric and the steady sound of his breath as he worked. He adjusted the fall of the silk so it framed her shoulders rather than hiding them, guiding it to follow the lines he had already cut into the leather. His fingers moved with practiced precision, pinning the silk at strategic points, creating a contrast between strength and refinement. He stepped down from the stool and circled her, checking how the light caught the blue against her skin. The color deepened the green, made the old scars look like marks of history rather than damage. She did not open her eyes. She remained still, as if any sudden movement might break whatever fragile arrangement had formed between them. He reached up once more to straighten the edge near her throat, his knuckles brushing lightly against her jaw. She did not flinch. The trust in that stillness was louder than any threat she had made the night before. He tugged gently at the fabric to ensure it did not pull too tight across her chest, then smoothed it flat with the side of his hand. "There," he said softly, though he had not yet finished. Her eyes opened slowly. She looked down at the silk draped over her body, at the way it moved when she shifted her weight, at how it did not restrict her but accompanied her. She lifted one arm slightly, testing the range of motion, and the fabric followed without resistance. Her brow furrowed, not in anger, but in something like disbelief. "This will tear," she said, voice low as if warning him. "Not if it is cut correctly," he replied, already reaching for needle and thread. "And not if you stand as you are standing now." She glanced toward the broken door, toward the alley beyond, where faint sounds still drifted from time to time. Her instincts tugged at her, urging readiness, urging hardness. The silk rested on her shoulders like a quiet argument against that life. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed she might strip it off and return to the familiar roughness of leather alone. Instead, she straightened further, as if accepting the challenge of wearing something that did not belong to the arena. Julian began stitching the silk into the leather with small, nearly invisible seams, binding the two materials together so that neither overpowered the other. His hands worked steadily, the tremor from earlier replaced by focused control. He did not rush, he did not waste thread. Each stitch was placed as if the garment were not just clothing, but a statement he refused to compromise. When he finished securing the first section, he stepped back and studied her again. The blue silk framed her shoulders like a banner of her own choosing, not one forced upon her by a pitmaster. She stood taller now, without being told. Outside, a heavy fist struck the far end of the alley wall again, closer than before, and a voice called out a name that carried weight and ownership. Karga's eyes sharpened, but she did not move from her place in the center of the shop, the silk resting against her scars like a promise that had just been made. Julian tightened the final temporary stitch at her shoulder and stepped back, lowering his needle with a small nod of approval. And Karga shifted her weight experimentally, the leather and silk moving with her instead of against her, the structure holding firm while the fabric flowed. She rolled one shoulder, then the other, testing the range as if preparing for a strike, and nothing pulled out of place. The motion was controlled, deliberate, no longer the hunched readiness of someone expecting a blow from any direction. He watched closely, eyes tracking the way the garment settled along her torso, adjusting one seam at her side with quick fingers when it dipped a fraction too low. "Walk," he said, gesturing across the narrow length of the shop. She looked at him as if the command were strange, but she obeyed, taking a slow step forward. The floor creaked under her weight, yet her back remained straight. The silk caught the light as she moved, no longer draped loosely but integrated into the leather in a way that suggested rank rather than decoration. She took another step, then turned, the movement smoother than the frantic pacing of the night before. He circled her again, hands clasped behind his back, studying the fall of the fabric from every angle. "You are not meant to shrink," he said, adjusting the collar so it framed her neck instead of covering it. "Stop trying to make yourself smaller than you are." She paused mid-step, absorbing the instruction, then squared her shoulders more fully, chin lifting without arrogance. The difference was immediate. The room did not feel crowded by her presence now. It felt defined by it. She walked back toward him and stopped, looking down at her own hands resting against the dark leather. The scars along her knuckles seemed less like marks of ownership and more like evidence of survival. She flexed her fingers slowly, watching how the sleeves accommodated the movement without strain. "This is not armor," she said again, quieter than before. "No," Julian replied, crouching to adjust the hem near her knee, trimming a fraction of excess leather with precise snips. "Armor tells the world you expect to be struck. This tells the world you expect to stand." He rose and smoothed the front panel flat, pressing the leather lightly with his palm. The gesture was firm, but not possessive. Karga moved to the small mirror nailed crookedly to the wall near the fabric shelves. It was hardly large enough to reflect her fully, but she leaned slightly to catch her upper body in its surface. The image staring back at her was not the caged fighter she knew. The leather followed clean lines. The silk framed her shoulders with controlled elegance. She did not look owned. She looked deliberate. Her breathing changed, subtle but steady. She rolled her shoulders back again, this time without prompting, and the posture held. The instinct to hunch seemed to fight within her, but she resisted it, keeping her spine straight. Julian watched without speaking, allowing the silence to settle around her choice. Outside, a cart rattled past at the far end of the street. Then silence returned. The earlier banging had ceased for the moment, but the air still felt heavy, as if something waited just beyond sight. Karga stepped away from the mirror and stood in the center of the room again, feet planted evenly, hands relaxed at her sides. The stance was no longer defensive. It was grounded. Julian moved to his work table and began reinforcing the inner seams with stronger thread, hands working quickly now that the structure was confirmed. "You will need to move freely," he said, threading the needle. If you twist too sharply, the silk may strain. Do not waste it." She gave a small huff that might have been amusement. "I do not waste what is given," she replied. He glanced up at that, meeting her eyes briefly, then returned to his stitching. The rhythm of needle through leather resumed, steady and purposeful. She remained standing, no longer seeking the darkest corner of the room, no longer scanning for immediate escape. Instead, she faced the crooked door head-on. A shadow passed briefly across the thin line of light beneath it. Karga's gaze sharpened, posture holding firm rather than collapsing inward. Julian did not look up this time. He tied off a knot and reached for thicker thread. The next sound was not a knock, but a slow, deliberate scrape along the outer wall, as if someone were tracing the building's edge, counting doors. Julian set 2 cups on the table and poured tea with the same care he used when measuring silk. And the simple domestic act made the shop feel briefly like a place that belonged to someone again, instead of a hiding hole with a broken door. Karga sat opposite him on the reinforced chair, shoulders filling the space. The new garment now more assembled than pinned, leather panels secured, and the blue silk stitched into place so it rested cleanly along her upper body. She held the clay cup between thick fingers, adjusting her grip with surprising delicacy, and the contrast made Julian's eyes flick to her hands more than once before he returned his attention to his own cup. He took a sip and set it down, then reached for a scrap of fabric beside his plate of needles and began trimming loose threads with small snips. He could not fully stop working, even now. His hands needed something to correct. Karga watched him for a while, eyes following the motion of blade and thread, the quiet in her face not empty but wary, like a guard standing at ease, yet ready. "You do this," she said at last, voice low, "for all." The question was blunt, not romantic, not softened. Julian did not answer right away. He tightened one last knot, then finally looked at her. "I do it," he said, "for the work." He lifted his cup again, drank, and his gaze flicked to the crooked door as if checking the world remained at bay. "People come to me for clothing. Clothing is not a favor. It is a contract." Karga's eyes narrowed slightly. "And if I leave?" she asked. "You lose." Julian's jaw tightened. He set the cup down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table. "If you leave," he replied, "you will take my silk with you, and I will have wasted something I cannot replace." His voice was sharp, but the statement was not a threat. It was the closest he could come to admitting he had invested in her. Karga looked down at the silk on her shoulders, then back at him. "In the pits," she said, words slow. "They covered us in paint." To make the crowd laugh. To show we were not warriors, only beasts. Her fingers tightened slightly around the cup, then loosened again before the clay could crack. "They never used cloth like this." Julian's hands paused over his thread for a fraction of a second. He did not offer comfort. He did not apologize for a world he had not built. He simply pulled the thread taut, neat and even. "Then they dressed you incorrectly," he said. Karga gave a short exhale, almost a laugh, but it died quickly. She took another sip of tea, and the warmth seemed to steady her. The shop was quiet enough that Julian could hear the faint scrape of her nails against the cup's rim. Careful, controlled, as if she were learning the weight of something fragile. For a moment, the two of them sat like that, the table between them scattered with tools and scraps, and the silence did not feel like a gap. It felt like something being held in place, like a seam pinned before stitching. A faint sound drifted through the shutters then, not loud, not sudden, but rhythmic, like a knuckle testing wood. Tap. 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 Julian's gaze snapped to the window. Karga's head turned slightly, ears angling toward the street. The tapping stopped. Another sound followed. A low murmur. More than one voice, close enough to carry intent, but not clear enough to make out words. Julian set his cup down, slower this time. His fingers moved toward the heavy iron shears hanging on the wall by habit rather than bravery, then stopped short as he forced himself to remain still. Karga did not reach for a weapon, because she had none. Instead, she placed her cup down with care and stood, the chair creaking under the shift. She did not hunch. She did not retreat to the corner. She stepped beside the door and faced it. Julian rose more reluctantly, body lighter and weaker, yet his posture sharpened, pulled upright by stubbornness. He reached for the latch, then hesitated, listening. A pause. Then the sound of something wet dragging along stone, like a smear being traced. Karga's eyes flicked to him. "They follow blood," she said quietly, the words carrying certainty rather than fear. Julian's mouth tightened. He looked down at the floorboards near the threshold, at the faint stains that had dried darker overnight, and his fingers curled into his palm as if pinching thread. He had cleaned, but not enough. He had patched, but not sealed. The tapping returned, heavier now, not on the shutters, but directly on the door, slow and confident, as if whoever stood outside knew exactly what was behind it and had no need to hurry. The knocking turned into a heavy, deliberate pounding that made the crooked door jump against its frame, and Julian's hand went to the latch, not to open it, but to brace it, fingers pressing hard against wood that had already failed once. The voice that followed did not shout. It rolled through the alley with calm ownership, calling Karga's name as if summoning livestock rather than a person, and each syllable landed slow and certain. Karga's shoulders tightened beneath the leather and silk, the old reflex rising in her spine, and she took one step back as if preparing to tear the new garment off before it could be damaged. Her hands moved toward the fastening at her side, fingers already seeking the seam. Julian turned sharply and caught her wrist, not with force, but with urgency, his grip small against her skin, yet unyielding. "What are you doing?" he demanded, voice low and tight. She did not look at him at first. Her gaze remained fixed on the door as the pounding came again, harder now, the hinges groaning. "I will not ruin it," she said, words clipped. "They will drag me. It will tear." Her fingers tugged at the edge of the silk, careful even in panic. He stepped in front of her, forcing her to look down at him. The difference in height was almost absurd, his head barely reaching her chest, yet his stance blocked her hands from undoing the work. "You will not remove it," he said, each word placed with the same precision as a stitch. The pounding outside intensified, a boot striking wood, followed by a rough laugh from one of the enforcers. Dust shook loose from the doorframe. Karga's jaw clenched. "They own me," she said flatly, the statement shaped by years rather than belief. Her fingers flexed again, torn between obedience to survival and the new weight of the silk on her shoulders. Julian's eyes hardened. "They own nothing in this room," he replied, voice rising for the first time. "And my work is not made to hang in a corner." Another blow landed against the door, splintering one of the upper panels. Light sliced through a new crack, thin and bright. Karga's breathing quickened, but she did not rip the garment away. Instead, she looked down at the leather fitted to her frame, at the silk stitched firmly into place. Her hands hovered, uncertain. Julian released her wrist and moved past her toward the work table, grabbing the heavy iron shears from their hook on the wall. The weight of them dragged his arm slightly downward, but he adjusted his grip, holding them in both hands. "Masterpieces," he said, not looking at her now. are made to be worn in battle if necessary." His knuckles whitened around the handles. The pounding stopped abruptly, replaced by a low murmur outside, then the scrape of metal against wood. A blade tip pierced through the cracked panel and pried downward, widening the split. Julian's heart hammered visibly in the tremor of his shoulders, but he did not step aside. He planted himself between the door and Karga, the shears raised awkwardly in front of him like an oversized pair of claws. Karga stared at his back, at the thin line of his spine beneath his vest, at the way his arms strained to hold the heavy tools steady. The world she knew dictated that strength stood in front, that the larger body took the first strike. Yet here he was, smaller and softer, refusing to move. The blade outside tore a longer gap through the wood, and a hand reached in to fumble with the latch. Julian swung the shears down in a desperate arc, not with skill but with raw intent, the metal blade slamming against the intruding hand. A shout erupted from the alley, followed by a curse and the sound of someone stumbling back. Karga's eyes sharpened, something shifting in them. She stepped forward, not to surrender, but to stand directly behind Julian, close enough that her presence pressed against him like a wall. Her hands no longer reached for the seams of her garment. They hung at her sides, ready. Outside, the voice that had called her name earlier spoke again, louder now, edged with irritation rather than calm. "Open!" it commanded, as if the door's obedience were inevitable. Julian tightened his grip on the shears and glanced toward the vats of dye simmering faintly near the back wall, red and thick from the morning's work. Steam curled upward in slow spirals. He swallowed once, then shifted his stance. The next Udar did not test the door. It crashed against it with full force, and the top hinge finally gave way. The upper hinge tore free with a sharp crack, and the door sagged inward, held only by the lower pin and the stubborn weight of the crate Julian had wedged beneath it. And splinters rained across the floor as a heavy boot slammed through the broken panel to clear the rest. Julian stumbled back half a step, the iron shears dragging his arms down with their weight. But he forced himself upright again, planting his heels against the floorboards as two enforcers shoved their way into the narrow shop. The first man through the gap was broad and scarred, one sleeve rolled high to reveal a branded mark that matched the symbol painted on the pit walls, and his eyes locked immediately on Karga, not with relief but with possession. Behind him another man squeezed in, ducking under the hanging coats and knocking over a stack of folded linen without apology. "Found you," the first one said, voice low and satisfied, as if this were a simple errand completed. His gaze slid over the leather and silk fitted to her body, confusion flickering for a second at the sight of something so deliberate, then hardening into annoyance. "You dress her up now," he added, looking at Julian with open disdain, "like she is something to keep." Julian did not answer. He raised the shears higher, though his hands shook, and positioned himself squarely between the men and Karga. The blades looked small compared to the clubs hanging from the enforcers' belts, yet he held them as if they were forged for war. The second man stepped forward and shoved him in the chest, not hard enough to break bones, but enough to send him stumbling back into his cutting table, tools clattering to the floor. Karga moved instantly at that, her foot sliding forward, but she stopped herself before striking, eyes flicking to Julian as he pushed himself upright again, face pale but jaw locked. He did not retreat behind her. Instead, he stepped forward once more, lifting the shears in an awkward, defensive arc that forced the closest enforcer to hesitate. "You will not touch her," Julian said, breath tight in his chest. The first man laughed, a harsh sound that filled the cramped room. "She is not yours to protect," he replied, reaching out as if to grab Karga by the arm. His fingers brushed the leather at her sleeve, testing the material with a smirk. This comes off. Julian reacted before thought could catch up. He swung the shears downward in a clumsy but desperate motion, the heavy blades biting into the wooden handle of the club the man had begun to raise. The impact jarred his arms painfully, but it knocked the weapon aside long enough to create space. The second enforcer lunged forward to seize Julian by the collar, and in that scramble, Julian's foot caught the edge of one of the dye vats simmering near the press. The vat rocked dangerously. Steam burst upward as it tilted, thick red liquid sloshing over the rim. Julian's eyes darted to it, and in a sudden, reckless motion, he shoved the entire vat forward with both hands. The boiling dye cascaded outward in a wide arc, splattering across the chest and face of the man closest to him. A scream tore through the shop, raw and startled, as the red liquid soaked cloth and skin alike, staining everything in its path. The man staggered back, blinded by heat and color, crashing into the shelves and sending bolts of fabric tumbling to the floor. The second enforcer recoiled instinctively, throwing an arm over his face to shield from the spray, and in that instant of chaos, the balance shifted. Karga stepped forward. Her movements were no longer frantic or wild. They were controlled, deliberate, each step placed with the stability Julian had drilled into her posture. The leather held firm along her shoulders, the silk framing her as she drove her palm into the chest of the second enforcer, sending him stumbling backward into the broken door. She did not roar. She did not snarl. She simply advanced, forcing them to retreat. Julian, breath ragged, grabbed the shears again with both hands and positioned himself at her side, rather than in front of her this time. The first man, still shouting and wiping at his face, tried to regain footing, but the floor was slick with dye and scattered cloth. He slipped, crashing onto his back with a curse. From the alley beyond the shattered doorway, a heavier set of footsteps approached, slower and more measured than the others, and the voice that had called Karga's name earlier spoke again, closer now, edged with cold irritation. "Move aside," it ordered, not to Julian, not to the fallen men, but to the world itself. Karga's eyes lifted toward the doorway, shoulders squared, the silk at her collar catching the light as steam rose in red clouds around her, and Julian tightened his grip on the shears as the shadow of the pit boss filled the broken frame. The pit boss stepped over the fallen enforcer without haste, his boots leaving dark prints through the spilled dye, as if he were walking across a battlefield he already owned. And he did not raise his voice when he spoke again, because he did not need to. He was thicker than the others, shoulders wide beneath a heavy coat reinforced with metal plates, and a thick chain hung at his belt like a reminder of what he believed belonged to him. His eyes went first to Karga, assessing, calculating, then slid to Julian with open contempt. "You stain my property," he said, glancing briefly at the red splashed across the floor and the groaning man trying to wipe boiling dye from his face. Julian swallowed visibly but did not step back. The shears in his hands felt heavier now, slick with moisture from his own palms, yet he kept them raised between himself and the larger man. "She is not property," he replied, the words thin but steady. The pit boss gave a slow smile that did not reach his eyes, and took one deliberate step forward, boots crunching over broken wood. Karga's stance shifted subtly, weight distributing evenly across her feet the way Julian had forced her to practice, shoulders squared, chin level. The leather and silk moved with her, no longer foreign against her skin. The pit boss noticed the garment properly for the first time, gaze traveling over the clean lines, the fitted structure. His smile faded. "You dress her like a warrior," he said, voice cooling. "She fights because I tell her to." Julian's grip tightened on the shears. He did not look at Karga now. He kept his eyes on the man in front of him, even as his body angled slightly to shield her again. "She stands because I fitted her correctly," he answered, absurd and defiant all at once. The pit boss's expression hardened at the tone more than the words. He moved faster than Julian expected, one hand shooting out to shove him aside. Julian tried to brace, but the force sent him crashing into the iron press, his shoulders striking the edge with a dull thud. The shears nearly slipped from his grasp. Pain flashed across his face in the tightening of his jaw, but he did not drop the blades. The pit boss reached past him toward Karga, fingers stretching as if to seize her by the collar of the new garment. Karga did not retreat. Instead, she stepped forward into the reach, catching the pit boss's wrist mid-motion. The difference in size between them was less dramatic than between her and Julian, but the strength in her grip was unmistakable. The leather at her shoulder flexed but did not strain. The silk did not tear. She twisted his arm downward with controlled force, forcing him to bend at the waist to relieve the pressure. "You return," the pit boss growled through clenched teeth, trying to wrench free. Karga's expression did not flare with rage. It settled into something colder. "No," she said, the word simple and final. He swung his free arm toward her ribs, aiming for a bruising blow meant to break resistance quickly. The strike landed, but the leather absorbed part of it, distributing the impact rather than letting it focus on bone. She shifted with it, stance wide, and drove her knee into his thigh, destabilizing him without wildness. He staggered back a half step, surprise flashing across his face as if he had expected the old reaction, the obedient flinch. Julian pushed himself off the iron press, shoulders stiff, and grabbed another smaller pot of dye from the table, this one thick and dark. He did not calculate distance or angle. He simply hurled it with both hands toward the pit boss's chest. The pot struck and shattered, liquid exploding across the man's coat and face, the sudden heat and shock forcing him to recoil. He cursed, wiping at his eyes, momentarily blinded by steam and color. Karga moved in that opening. She caught him by the front of his coat and pivoted, using his own weight to throw him off balance. The maneuver was not flashy, it was efficient. He crashed backward through the broken doorway, landing hard in the mud of the alley, breath knocked from him. The two enforcers inside scrambled to follow, slipping on dye and cloth, dragging themselves through the wrecked entrance. Julian stood in the center of the ruined shop, chest heaving, shears still clutched in shaking hands. Karga stepped to the threshold, not crossing into the alley yet, but standing tall within the frame of splintered wood. Outside, the pit boss struggled to rise, coated in red, boots sliding in mud as he glared up at her with something that was no longer pure ownership. It was calculation mixed with something sharper. Behind Karga, the shop was wrecked, shelves overturned, fabric stained, steam hanging in the air like a fading storm. In front of her, the alley held men who had never been denied before. Julian moved to her side, smaller and unsteady but present, the heavy shears lowering only slightly as the pit boss planted his hands in the mud and began to push himself back to his feet. The pit boss lurched upright in the mud, red dye dripping from his coat and chin like a grotesque parody of blood, and he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, smearing the color further across his face, while his gaze locked onto Karga with a fury that had lost its calm. The alley had drawn a few distant onlookers who hovered at the far end, uncertain whether to step closer or disappear, and the two enforcers scrambled to flank their leader, one still blinking rapidly from the earlier splash. Julian stood just inside the broken doorway, boots planted on dye-soaked floorboards, the iron shears hanging at his side now rather than raised, his arm trembling from the strain and the impact against the press. Karga stepped fully into the alley, boots sinking slightly into the mud, leather creaking softly as she moved, and the silk at her shoulders caught a dull glint of light even under the grime and steam drifting out behind her. She did not charge. She did not roar. She simply walked forward until she stood a few paces from the pit boss, shoulders square, chin lifted the way Julian had insisted. The garment framed her stance so clearly that even from a distance she did not look like prey dragged from a ring. She looked like someone who had chosen where to stand. "You forget who feeds you." The pit boss spat, shaking red droplets from his sleeve, though his voice carried less certainty than before. He reached for the chain at his belt as if it were proof of authority, letting it clink loudly in the alley. The sound was meant to remind her of old bindings. Karga's gaze dropped briefly to the chain, then rose again to his face, steady and unflinching. "I was fed to fight," she replied, voice low but carrying. "Not fed to live." The words were simple, stripped of flourish, and they landed heavier than any shouted challenge. The pit boss took a step toward her, boots slipping slightly in the mud, and swung the chain in a short arc aimed at her shoulder. She shifted her weight the way Julian had trained her to balance, letting the chain glance off the reinforced leather rather than wrapping around her arm. The impact thudded against the structured panel and slid away, the silk beneath remaining intact. She stepped inside the arc of the swing before he could recover, catching the chain with one hand and yanking it hard. The sudden pull dragged him forward off balance, his boots losing grip again on the wet ground. Julian watched from the doorway, breath shallow, one hand braced against the splintered frame as if he might collapse without it. He did not rush in, he could not. Instead, he scanned the alley quickly and grabbed a broken length of door frame that had fallen outward during the breach. It was not much of a weapon, just a jagged piece of wood, but he held it ready, eyes darting between Karga and the enforcers who hesitated at the edges of the fight. The pit boss lunged again, trying to drive his shoulder into Karga's midsection to force her back toward the shop. This time she did not absorb the blow passively. She planted her feet and caught him at the collar, fingers digging into the thick fabric of his coat, and pivoted with controlled force, redirecting his momentum. He stumbled past her and nearly collided with the alley wall, catching himself at the last second with a curse. The two enforcers looked at each other, uncertainty creeping into their posture. They had expected a quick retrieval, a beaten fighter dragged home. Instead, they were watching their leader struggle in mud against someone who stood taller with every exchange. Julian stepped forward a half pace, raising the jagged wood as if daring them to try their luck inside the shop again. His stance was awkward, not that of a trained fighter, but stubborn. Karga advanced once more, not fast, not reckless, and delivered a solid shove to the pit boss's chest that sent him sprawling backward into a shallow puddle. Mud splashed high, staining his already ruined coat. She did not follow him to strike while he was down. She stood over him, breathing steady, leather and silk barely ruffled despite the force of the movements. "You will not take me," she said, the statement calm, not shouted. The pit boss glared up at her, mud clinging to his hair and dye streaking his face, and for a moment the alley was silent except for his labored breathing. He looked past her at Julian in the doorway, at the wrecked shop, at the onlookers pretending not to stare. Finally, with a sharp exhale, he rolled to his side and pushed himself to his feet without another attempt to swing. He spat into the mud, red mixing with brown. "Keep her," he muttered, the words forced through clenched teeth, and gestured sharply to his men. They hesitated only a second before helping him steady himself and retreating down the alley, boots slipping but moving faster with every step away. Karga remained standing in the center of the alley long after they had turned the corner, shoulders still squared, hands relaxed at her sides. Julian lowered the broken wood slowly, his chest rising and falling unevenly as he watched the figures disappear, the red-stained mud marking their path like a retreating banner. Julian stepped carefully over the broken threshold and into the alley once the pit boss and his men disappeared around the corner, his boots sinking into the mud already streaked with red dye, and he reached out as if to confirm that Karga was still solid and not some vision conjured by exhaustion. He did not touch her at first. He simply stood beside her, breathing unevenly, the jagged piece of door frame still clutched in his hand like a ridiculous trophy. Karga turned her head slightly toward him, eyes calmer now, the hard edge that had faced the pit boss softening by degrees as the immediate threat receded. "Inside," Julian said after a moment, voice hoarse but controlled, and he gestured toward the wrecked shop rather than the street beyond, as if the ruined interior were somehow more inviting than the open world. She obeyed without argument, stepping back over the broken door and into the space that now looked like the aftermath of a storm. Shelves half emptied, fabric scattered, dye pooled and cooling across the floorboards. The steam had thinned, leaving the air heavy and damp. Julian set the splintered wood aside and surveyed the damage with a tailor's eye rather than a victim's. He moved first to the overturned cutting table, righting it with effort, then to the fallen bolts of cloth, lifting each carefully to assess whether the dye had ruined them entirely or if salvage was possible. His movements were slower now, the strain in his shoulder evident in the slight hitch when he lifted heavier pieces. But he did not complain. Karga stood in the center of the room for a few seconds, as she had done before, leather and silk still intact, mud spattered along the lower hem. Then she bent and began gathering fabric as well, her large hands surprisingly gentle as she shook excess dye from the edges and folded what could be saved. The sight of her massive frame moving through the wreckage with deliberate care shifted the atmosphere of the shop from chaos to quiet repair. At one point she paused near the iron press, examining the dent Julian's body had made against its side. She ran her fingers lightly over the metal, then glanced toward him. He noticed and waved the concern away with a short motion. "It will hold," he said, even though his shoulder protested when he reached for another roll of leather. She stepped closer without comment and lifted the heavier bolts for him, setting them on the table with controlled strength that did not strain the seams of her garment. The blue silk at her shoulders was smudged near one edge, but it had not torn. Julian noticed immediately. He approached with a small cloth and dabbed at the stain, careful not to spread it further. He had to stand on the stool again to reach properly, and as he did, the absurd contrast returned. A slender human adjusting the collar of a towering orc who had just thrown a pit boss into the mud. "Hold still," he murmured, focusing on the fabric rather than the memory of the fight. She obeyed, eyes forward, posture straight. He smoothed the silk flat, checking the stitching along the collarbone. None of the seams had split. The leather panels remained aligned. His jaw loosened slightly at the confirmation. "You fought well," he said finally, not looking at her face but at the garment's structure, as if the compliment were directed at the cut and construction rather than the person wearing it. Karga's lips curved faintly at one corner. "It did not tear," she replied, touching the leather near her ribs where the chain had struck. The statement held more weight than pride in victory. Julian stepped down from the stool and moved to the door frame, lifting the broken panel that still hung from the lower hinge. He inspected the splintered edge inside, then began measuring it with his tape as if planning a replacement already. "I will need new wood," he muttered, half to himself. "Stronger hinges." He glanced toward Karga, then added, "and perhaps a lock that respects its purpose." She watched him for a long moment, then moved to help brace the door upright while he examined the frame. The alley outside was quiet now, the earlier onlookers gone, leaving only the faint drip of dye from the threshold into the mud. Together they lifted the door back into position temporarily, Karga holding it steady while Julian wedged crates and scrap wood to keep it from collapsing again. When they finally stepped back to assess their work, the shop was still damaged, still stained, but upright. Karga stood near the center again, not as a fugitive this time, but as someone who had defended ground. Julian wiped his hands on a clean strip of cloth and looked up at her, eyes traveling once more over the clean lines of leather and silk. Outside, a distant cart rolled past as if nothing significant had happened, and the world resumed its indifferent rhythm. Inside, the two of them stood among scattered fabric and cooling dye, the broken door propped stubbornly in place, and the silence between them felt less like aftermath and more like the beginning of something steady. Julian climbed onto the low stool once more with the needle threaded in steady hands, and Karga stood in the center of the half-repaired shop while he adjusted the line of her collar as if nothing in the world were more urgent than the angle of silk against leather. The floor still bore red stains. The door was held upright by crates and stubbornness, and scraps of fabric lay folded in uneven stacks waiting to be salvaged, yet his focus narrowed to the seam beneath her throat. He tugged lightly at the silk, aligning it so it framed her shoulders with exact symmetry, then secured a final reinforcing stitch with careful precision. "Do not slouch," he said quietly, not as a command barked in a ring, but as a reminder placed gently between them. Karga straightened without resistance, chin lifting a fraction, and the movement felt natural now rather than forced. The leather followed the curve of her back, the silk resting cleanly along the line of her collarbone, and the entire garment seemed to settle into its intended shape. Julian tied off the thread and snipped it close, inspecting the result with a critical eye that finally softened. He stepped down from the stool and took 2 paces back, hands clasped behind him as he evaluated her the way he once had evaluated nobles in candlelit halls. There was mud at the hem and faint discoloration along one edge of silk, but the structure held, and, more importantly, so did her posture. She did not look toward the corner anymore. She did not measure the distance to the door. She stood squarely in the middle of the room, as if it were a place she had chosen. Karga glanced down at him, then around at the wrecked shelves and patched door. "It is broken," she said, nodding toward the interior. Her voice carried no accusation, only observation. Julian followed her gaze and gave a small, dismissive tilt of his head. "Wood can be replaced," he replied. "Fabric can be cleaned. Hinges can be reinforced." He paused, then added, "Standards are harder to rebuild." She studied him for a moment, eyes steady, and then moved toward the fallen iron press. Without being asked, she set her hands beneath its heavy base and shifted it back into perfect alignment against the wall, adjusting it with controlled strength until it sat level. Julian watched the movement closely, as if committing the new arrangement to memory. He walked over and tested the lever once more. It descended smoothly, pressing an abandoned scrap of leather flat without complaint. Together they began the quiet work of restoration again, Karga lifting and sorting, Julian trimming and restacking, their movements falling into an unspoken rhythm. When he reached for a bolt too heavy for his sore shoulder, she handed it to him without comment. When she hesitated over a piece of stained silk, he took it gently and demonstrated how to dab rather than scrub. The shop did not return to its former state in minutes, but it began to resemble intention instead of damage. At last, when the worst of the chaos had been managed, Julian carried 2 cups of tea back to the table and set one before her without ceremony. She accepted it, this time without testing the scent first, and lowered herself carefully into the reinforced chair. The leather creaked softly as she bent, but the seams held. Julian sat opposite her, posture still precise despite the fatigue in his shoulders. They drank in silence, the steam rising between them. Outside, the alley remained quiet. No chains clinking, no voices claiming ownership. The broken door stood crooked but closed, held by wood and will. Karga looked down at her reflection in the dark surface of the tea, catching a faint glimpse of blue silk at the edge of the cup. "You will need stronger hinges," she said after a while. Julian nodded once. "And you will need proper boots," he replied, glancing at the mud caked along the hem of her garment. The corner of her mouth lifted slightly at that. The shop was smaller than her past and poorer than his. Yet within its walls, something had shifted that neither of them spoke aloud. She had not been returned. He had not stepped aside. The garment he had crafted did more than cover scars. It demanded that she stand as if she had never been owned at all. Julian reached across the table and adjusted the cup so it aligned neatly with the edge, a habitual motion that drew a brief rumble of quiet amusement from her chest. He did not look embarrassed. He simply reached for his measuring tape again and draped it over the back of his chair, ready for whatever fitting might come next. In the stillness of the repaired room, with dye-stained boards beneath their feet and silk resting proudly on scarred shoulders, dignity no longer looked like a title granted by a court or a crowd. It looked like a garment stitched by steady hands and worn without lowering one's gaze.